Well, it's good to be with you today, small group. Aren't small groups amazing? Right now in our Zoom rooms, why don't we just give a little round of applause for our small group leaders, our small group hosts who are hospitable to us and work hard to prepare these times for us together. And on Sunday, we kicked off our series, Church Defined. And the subtitle of the series is Who We Are versus Who We're Called to Be. It's my firm conviction as the pastor of Sunny Hill that there's an opportunity before us to really rethink, and not even to rethink and reimagine, but almost rediscover the church that God has in his heart for us to be. I believe exceptional times that we're living in. The world is crazy. I mean, you know that. I'm assuming you've got access to the news channel. Crazy. Or a news app or something, and we can just see all over the place that there is difficulty, challenge, struggle, and a whole heap of deception just plaguing the world right now. And the inclination can be to think, well, if we can just make our churches a little bit more trendy or a little bit more culturally relevant, then maybe we will see the upturn that all of us long for in our hearts. And it's my belief, however, especially over the last year, as we have not been doing church in the classic Sunny Hill way, you know, quite a Sunday-centric way of doing church, been reflecting on, you know, what does this mean for us in 2021? How are we to respond? And so on Sunday, we kicked off a message where we were looking at the bride of Christ. And today at Small Group, I want us to explore that a little bit further, to discuss and have a conversation around some of the implications of what it means to be the bride of Christ. But before we get into that conversation, let me just remind you of some of the stuff I shared at Poole Campus on Sunday, specifically to do with the term, the church, a term that we see Jesus use in Matthew 16, when he says that profound promise, you know, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not overcome it. What does he mean when he says the church? It's kind of interesting thing, really, because we just assume that, like, we all understand what Jesus is talking about. But actually, where we get our word the church from, it's really interesting. A Greek word that is kyriakon doma, which breaks down as the Lord's house. Kyriakon, the Lord's, doma, referring to like dome, home, house, covering. That's where we get our term the church from. The problem is that term didn't come around. The origin of that word was about 300 years after Jesus came, died, and rose again and ascended to the right hand of the Father. So the reason we get church from that word is because kyriakon doma was shortened to kirk, which we translate into our English language as church. So kirk and church, we can see kind of the symmetry there, is the word that we read in our Bibles in Matthew 16. But the problem with that translation is that, you know, obviously the Lord's house speaks to a physical location, a physical place, a building, a physical structure of some sort. But the word that Jesus actually uses in Matthew 16 is the Greek word ekklesia. Ekklesia actually dates back to about 300 years before Christ. It's a Greek word, and there's loads of cool stuff wrapped around the origin of the word ekklesia. But really it speaks to a gathering of people, an assembling of people specifically for a purpose. And it's kind of amazing because when Jesus looks at his disciples in Matthew 16 and says, I will build my church. What he actually says is, I will build my ecclesia. In other words, I will build my gathering. I will build my congregation. I will build my assembly. And of course, I think this has huge implications for us as the church, because so often we reduce our understanding of church to just being the physical place in which we meet. But Jesus seems to be suggesting that there's another way that we should be thinking about this, that church isn't a place we attend, it's a place we become. It's something that we become. It's not what we do, it's who we are. And on that basis, I'd really like you for a few moments to pause this video and just kind of explore a couple of questions and allow the conversation to flow and see where you go with it. But I really want us to think about the implications of understanding the church as the ecclesia of God. Okay, so just check that out and we'll come back together after you've answered these questions. Well, I hope you had a really fruitful conversation with loads of robust discussion. You know, actually talking some of these things through is so essential to our growth as Christians. We never just want to listen to a preach on Sunday and go, oh, that's nice. We want to get into small groups and huddles and relationships and really thrash some of the stuff we're hearing and processing it together, because as we begin to vocalize it and talk about it, actually I believe that seeds are planted into our heart and our understanding increases. But on Sunday we talked about the church being the bride of Christ, the church being the bride of Christ, which, you know, it is really, I think, a difficult thing for lots of people to swallow. Personally, I confess to this Sunday at Poole campus, I struggle with it. I struggle with it because, if you hadn't noticed, I'm a bloke. And, you know, I like blokey things. I like football. I like weight training, obviously. You know, I like doing manly things. I like building stuff. I like constructing things. I love wrestling with my boys and any other boys that are willing to wrestle with me. Appropriately, obviously. But like the thing for me is, as soon as you give a term something the bride of Christ, I feel like there's this emasculation that happens. I feel like all of a sudden my identity as a man is kind of compromised, and it's like, oh, well, you know, I'm up for being the church, but the bride of Christ, I'm not so sure about that. And so on Sunday we just kind of encourage people just to try to put that to the side for a moment, because in it there's a brilliant metaphor that helps us understand how God views the church. And at Poole campus we explored some of Ephesians 5, where Paul gives some very specific teaching about earthly marriages. You know, how wives and husbands are to relate to one another. Wives submit to their husbands, obviously, which in modern days, you know, generally probably considered quite a prejudicial thing, but we believe that biblically it's actually a beautiful thing, and it's not an issue of control. It's actually an issue of liberty and release and love and surrender. But in equal measure, husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loves the church. And it's at that point where we see now this symmetry that Paul is using, comparing earthly marriages to this kind of hybrid marriage between earth and heaven, between Jesus and the church. And, you know, we explored this idea that really God instituted marriages for three reasons. The first one was one of procreation, you know, so you're married and you have kids, preferably in that order, and you raise kids, and those kids become good citizens that then procreate again. So that was one purpose of the institution of marriage. The second purpose was to speak into that need for community and that sense of being with somebody, that the two becoming one thing. And the third purpose of marriage was really to serve as an illustration and a type of relationship that Jesus has with the church. Now, this is kind of hard for us to decipher in 2021, because marriages, I want to say for the most part, but maybe that's too much of a blanket statement, but marriages are pretty dysfunctional. And we don't see marriages playing out the way that God would want marriages to play out. There is unfaithfulness, there's adultery, there's abuse, there's control, there's obviously all manner of things that can be associated with the breakdown of a marriage. But it doesn't necessarily help us understand the glorious relationship between Jesus and his bride, i.e. the church. But the overwhelming sense that we see in Scripture when it comes to Jesus and the church is that closeness of union. Because when we get to heaven, Jesus tells us in the Scriptures that actually marriage won't be a reality in heaven. Like, people won't be married and people won't be getting married in heaven. Why is that? You know, some of you may be disappointed to find that out. Some of you may be relieved to find that out. But ultimately, the reason that we have marriage on earth is to speak to some of those deep needs that we have, where in heaven we'll be totally fulfilled and totally satisfied in being one with Christ. That beautiful union that will happen, when Christ returns, and there's that marriage kind of glorious day where the church and Jesus are together as one. And so really, our fallen examples of marriage, really undermine the picture that God is trying to help us understand. But what it does speak to is this idea that, like, the church, first and foremost, and I need you to hear this, is not an event, it's not a service, it's not a program, it's not a building. The church is it's the passion of Jesus, it's the passion of God. It's his obsession, it's the apple of his eye, it's the pursuit of his heart. And really that picture of the bride and that picture of this marriage between Jesus and the church, it's not so much weird. It's not like, oh, I'm in my veil and I'm going to give Jesus a kiss or anything like that. It rather speaks to that union and that sense of fulfillment and completeness that we will experience on the other side of eternity. And so it's a glorious thing. But there are a couple of questions for you to kind of consider on this theme of the bride of Christ. Check them out, and when you've discussed them, we'll come back together for one more time. Wonderful. Well, I hope, again, you had a fruitful time of conversation. If you didn't, work harder next time. We're coming to the third and final part of this small group kind of conversation together. And I really want us to think about, okay, well, we've seen kind of God's attitude towards his bride, the church. But I want to talk about our attitude towards God as the bride, because bride is a kind of interesting word, isn't it? Whereas, we don't so much see the wife of Christ, we see the bride of Christ. Now, why is that? Well, because a bride speaks more of a preparation period. When you're a bride, you're preparing for that big day, for that union, that coming together. And I think it's an apt word, obviously, for the church. Well, obviously it is, because the Bible uses it. So who am I to say, yes, I encourage the use of that word and that term. But I think, like, biblically, in biblical times, marriage periods were drawn out much longer. It wasn't just like a shotgun wedding style, like a Las Vegas drive-through wedding. It was something that would go on for weeks, where family and friends would come and gather and build up to that big day. And this picture of the bride as one of preparation. And currently, if you look at the timeline of humanity, like eschatologically, I don't know if that's how you say it or not, I'm pretty sure it is. But if you were to look at the timeline, we're currently in what we call the church age. We're in this period between the cross happening and Jesus returning. So we're in the period of the church, we're in the time of the church. And actually this is a preparation time for Jesus's return. And it's on that we've been thinking on Sunday about the parable that Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, verses 1 to 13, the parable of the 10 virgins. And really it speaks to the need to be prepared. Now, I don't want to give you again kind of what I think that parable's really unpacking, because I really want you to have that conversation as a small group. But obviously in this, we're seeing some that are foolish, some virgins are foolish, some virgins are wise. They all have lamps. What does that represent? Some have oil, some don't. What does that represent? Some are awake. Well, actually, they're all asleep. What does that represent? I'd really love you to think, by looking at that parable, what does this mean for us? What do these virgins represent? What do these brides represent? And the bridegroom, what is playing out in this moment? And so with that, I'm really pleased that we're kicking off into this series. I believe over the coming weeks we're going to explore things that are really formative, not for Sunny Hill specific, but for the Church of Jesus Christ generic. You know, I said on Sunday at Poole campus that, like, typically when we do sermon series on the church, we focus on the Sunny Hill aspect. What is our USP? What is the thing that sets us apart from the church down the road? What is the thing that makes us unique in Christendom? But actually, I think now the time's coming where those things become less relevant. And actually what matters isn't what separates us from the church down the road, but actually what distinguishes us from the world outside our doors. So, you know, I really want to encourage you over the next few weeks to really check in with this series, because my hope is that we won't discover new things that the church is going to be, but we're going to recover old paths that the church has been called to walk in for millennia, and it's going to be so profitable to our walk with God. But have a great evening. Enjoy exploring this question together. What, in light of this passage in Matthew, on the parable of the 10 virgins, what is our responsibility as the bride of Christ? And let me just remind you, brothers and sisters, Jesus is coming back for his church, for his bride, and it's a glorious reality. Have a wonderful evening. Bless you guys. Bye.